Hello, it's Maggie, the Cheshire Crafter here. Now, most people who sew, after they finish a project, have scraps, and many wonder what to do with them. I've come up with an idea to create a memory quilt for me that will incorporate the scraps from each project and therefore will create a memory of the gift that I've given to the recipient. And I'm going to use postage stamp patchwork to do it. I'm going to show you first of all with Kaffe Fassett fabric, and then I will do it for each project. As I complete a project, if I save the scrap fabric and I have sufficient, I'll create a heart, and this heart will then be probably appliqued on to a 10-inch square, and in the future those 10-inch squares will become a memory quilt for me. I like the idea of that, don't you? Come and join me and see how I first of all create those postage stamp hearts. So this is my patchwork pattern out on graph paper. I photographed it more closely so that you can follow it more clearly. This postage stamp block takes 54 squares, and I cut those from 2.5-inch squares. So the squares that I began with were 1 1/4 inch. This leaves you with a tiny seam allowance of 1/8 of an inch, which is why I did this by hand. I'll show you on the back how much the seam allowance is. When we look at it, it's 54 squares, and at the widest point it will measure 9 inches across. It's 9 inches maximum from top to bottom. So if I was going to add this as an appliqué or patchwork to a block piece, I'd want at least a 10-inch square block. If you're buying pre-cut 2.5-inch squares and they've used pinking shears to stop the fabric from fraying, as you can see this does fray quite a lot, you're going to measure from the inside point of that pinking shear edge to across to the other side. We'll measure 2.5, not from that outer edge. It will throw you off by about 1/8 of an inch. And that's my selection. I've got a mixture of geometric shapes, florals, abstract, these are leaves. And I think the colours go well together. The other thing I wanted to check was the light and the darker shades. So I've gone from quite a light green here, a really vibrant green, and I think the darkest is probably a stripe on the dark purple there, stripe going across. What I will do is just check those in grayscale. Oh, this is quite dark, isn't it, in the centre here? Quite like that. Oh, there's 2 pieces there. Take that one instead of that one. And I'm going to check those in grayscale just to see what that looks like. While I was unable to sleep in my hotel room last night, I put on a video, and it was somebody doing the history of quilting going back to the settlers in America, and I found it absolutely fascinating. Now, my first recollection of anything patchwork related was a school trip we had when I must have been about 13, and we went from school to a 5-day break in Bath in England, in Somerset, and we went to the American Museum, and I'll never forget, I saw the American Museum display of patchwork quilts, and I thought they were absolutely magnificent. Now, at the time, we probably had a teacher who was a domestic science teacher who taught sewing, and we were in the sewing room. Everything that we learnt really frustrated me because it took a term to make a skirt. Well, you can run up a skirt in an afternoon, can't you, if you know what you're doing now. And I wasn't used to working with fabric, but it certainly was something that made a real impression upon me. And I remembered, I wonder whether somewhere amongst all my memory places, I've got a book on Bath and the American Museum. I certainly bought postcards at the time. I'll see if I can fish them out, and I'll show you, if I can, I'll show you them on my YouTube channel. So I've got 2 more than I need. When I work out the pattern design, I'm going to try and get a central feature that looks like the centre of a flower in the middle. And I'm going to use those petals to make them look like they're splaying out around the centre of a flower. And I want a good mix of light and dark, and those geometric shapes and petals and leaves around the outside. Let me show you what I mean with the heart that I did in pink. This is the way up, isn't it? In the centre of it, I had something rather reminiscent of stamens. It's not exactly centre, is it? But then I used the petal shapes to push the flower outwards so the petals were going in the direction that they normally would. And where they ended, or I've got a little bit of a leaf shape, they came on the edge of the design. And you see these light and dark shades interspersed. Where I had this very odd, almost Japanese geometric shape, I've made sure that they're not next to each other all the way through. Likewise, I'm not going to put the geometric stripes next to each other. So let's see when it's laid out what it'll look like. It's helpful to take a photograph and grayscale. The 2 pieces out, when you cut those 14-inch squares, these are the 2 pieces that I took out because they didn't look right in purple. And I moved around a few things, but I've got a good combination there, and then I checked it in grayscale. I'm going to photograph that so I know exactly where the pieces go, and then I'm going to pin them in columns right the way across. So I've pinned them in columns, and I've pinned them to a piece of paper that I can put into my file. I've got to go home tomorrow and do this, get this into my case. I don't want to lose my place, and I need to keep it flat. I'm going to start sewing now. I'm going to sew in columns, and I'm going to sew with the smallest one first. I'm going to go left to right. And in order to do that, I'm going to use a very fine bowhin needle. I'm going to use a Gutterman 100% polyester thread and my little scissors. And I can do all this by hand, not make any sound, in my hotel room, and then I can pick it up as and when I need by the time I get home. So let's get sewing. And I'm using a very small back stitch. I've knotted the end and not the other end too. Needs to be very secure. As I complete the rows, I'm going to store them this way, attached to the piece of paper. I've sewed the first row and finger pressed upwards. The second row that I'm just about to begin, I'm going to finger press downwards, so that hopefully my seams will nest. Good way to store them with these pins. After pressing and pressing the seams up and down so that they'll nest, you'll find it helpful, like I've done, just to pin them in place using this piece of paper. And then I'm going to sew the columns together don't forget we're now going in order, so it doesn't go straight across the top. I'll be sewing this piece here next to this 3. So we're doing according to the pattern, and I'm going to sew and then press alternate seams right and left. And there we have our heart finished. This is 54 squares. I think you can see that the majority is purple. There are pinks and blues and the very vibrant lime greens in there. I did press it on the back, and I pressed all the seams just to go one side. Now, what I will say about the Kaffe, can't say his name, Kaffe Fassett cotton, is it is expensive, but it is beautifully printed. The cotton thread is a very fine cotton thread, and there is a greater thread count to this. In the same way that you buy Egyptian cotton sheets, the thread count is higher than ordinary, and the thread count on this is 68 per square, as opposed to, that's probably per square inch, as opposed to a normal quilting fabric, which is 60 per square inch. It's also lighter in terms of weight. This is 110 grams per square metre, as opposed to the normal 150 grams per square metre. As space is limited for me, at the moment I'm just making up the patchwork hearts, and I'm going to keep them in this purple folder. I can keep my pattern in the front, and then behind it, let's take a look. I can keep the hearts stored in this way until I'm ready to use them. And I'll remind when I made them and what it reminds me of, and perhaps what fabric it is. This one, it's been the hottest summer, hasn't it? Now, the purple heart that I'm going to make, I did some of that sewing on holiday in Llandudno. And it's also the week the Queen died. This will remind me of that. And my current one is going to be, I made it August, September. I'm going to mark down what the fabric was and who I gift it to and on what occasion. And that will keep my work clean and dry and just take up very little space just on one of my bookshelves. Oops. Just on one of my bookshelves there until I'm ready to complete the quilt. I'm going to do about 16 of this type of blocks, so that'll be really helpful for me.